Chapter 3. Moomin Mama poured coffee into my cup, which I immediately began savoring. The caffeine made me feel a little more high-spirited, even though I was still dead beat. I had told the others about the horrors I had experienced the previous night a moment ago, and my friends reacted exactly like I had feared. Nobody believed me.
"You've been hallucinating because you haven't slept at all,"
said Moomin Papa, summarizing well what the others were surely thinking. Even the mysterious puddle of water next to my bed didn't raise any suspicions, and instead the others assumed I had spilled my water glass there. However, my nightly experiences felt so real that I didn't doubt them one bit. After drinking the coffee, I packed a few sandwiches and a thermos filled with coffee. Moomin Troll went with me, and so we started a long trip towards the witch's hut, which was located in the depths of a forest a few kilometers away. I was unbelievably tired, but kept trudging forward thanks to the coffee and the possible answers laying ahead. Our path finally led us into the forest, which was very old and so thick that only a few rays of light got through the foliage. However, I knew the forest like the back of my hand because we had often been here to collect mushrooms and blueberries. Finally, we arrived at the witch's hut, and I knocked on the door immediately. The door opened, and the witch beckoned us in. She immediately returned to her concoction and asked Moomin Troll how his parents were. I listened to their colloquial prattle for a moment until I decided to get straight to the point and asked what the witch knew about the Groke. When the old woman heard that word, she stopped stirring her bubbling liquid and started to scream. At the same moment, the atmosphere in the whole hut changed from homey to alienating and unpleasant. The witch told us to get out of her house and said that we shouldn't talk about things we didn't understand. She angrily slammed the door shut. But before the door closed, I observed indescribable fear in that old and also somewhat scary woman's eyes. Me and Moomin Troll looked at each other, confused, and even my friend admitted that something pretty weird was going on. I tried knocking on the door again, but the witch didn't let us in. It was completely silent inside the hut, so me and Moomin Troll started walking back towards the Moomin house. We hadn't managed to get very far when we met Alicia. She was the witch's grandchild, and after she'd heard about our visit to her grandmother that had ended unpleasantly, Alicia sighed and began telling a story that she remembered reading from a book she'd found in the basement of the hut when she was very young. According to Alicia, centuries ago, a woman lived in Moomin Valley who had kidnapped and killed dozens of the villagers' children during one summer. Most of the bodies were never found, but the few that were found were skinned and partly eaten. The killer was eventually caught, and the villagers decided to condemn her to a most painful death. For the whole winter, she was beaten, whipped, and kept in extremely cold conditions. One method involved keeping the woman in a hole in the ice until she turned blue. This torture lasted for 6 months, after which the woman was skinned alive and thrown to die in the ice-cold ocean. The woman's last words had been, "I'll be back." Shivers crawled up my spine when Alicia told us that, according to the book, the woman's name had been Groke. I looked at Moomin Troll, and he too looked like he had just seen a ghost. We thanked Alicia for the information and went immediately towards the Moomin house. I thanked the heavens that we had decided to get going early in the morning, since the forest felt uncomfortable even in the daytime. I wondered if I'd ever be able to sleep again, because my experience from last night coupled with Alicia's story was something so terrifying that it had completely incapacitated me. When I tried to speak, I felt like my words were getting tangled, and even swallowing felt difficult. I followed Moomin Troll, and my walking felt mechanical. I was in a kind of shock. Finally, we stepped out of the forest, and the bright blue summer sky immediately made me feel better, even though I could feel my fatigue increasing. We stopped and drank the rest of the coffee in the thermos. When we were about to keep going, we noticed little Mai running towards us. She greeted us and asked if we'd seen Sniff. Moomin Troll said no and looked at me worriedly. I realized we hadn't seen Sniff since the previous day, which was weird since usually he had more or less lived at the Moomin house and always came there for breakfast. This morning, however, Sniff hadn't showed up. Terrified, I went with little Mai and Moomin Troll towards Sniff's little house, which was only a stone throw away from where we were. We arrived at the house pretty fast, and as always, Sniff's windows were covered up even during the day. The house seemed silent, which was foreboding and made me even more convinced that there was an indescribable horror awaiting behind the door. Little Mai went to the door immediately and opened it. I followed Mai, and as I stepped in, I felt nauseous because we were met with the disgusting stench of urine and death. Even though the smell was repulsive, it was nothing compared to the sickly and horrifying sight before me. The house's entrance was fully covered in dried blood, and next to the bed laid Sniff's mangled corpse. The wrists were badly damaged, and scattered across the floor were torn pieces of artery and weird shreds of skin and muscle. When I saw the cheese slicer and grater next to the corpse, I realized he had mutilated his hands with them. However, the fatal blow had been made by the carpet knife with which Sniff had apparently cut a slice from his throat all the way to his ears, from which blood had flooded everywhere. Sniff's eyes had the same kind of shocked gaze as one of the two deceased guests. The most dreadful thing, however, was his mouth, which was twisted into an insane smile, from which I supposed that he had died slowly whilst accompanied by deranged laughter or some sort of pleasure. Moomin Troll had stayed outside the house, and I immediately shouted to him that Sniff had killed himself and that he shouldn't enter the house. At that moment, little Mai handed me a letter that quickly turned out to be a suicide message. Nevertheless, the contents of the letter confirmed all the fears I'd had thus far. It follows me. To be continued in the next chapter.